Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome to Nightlight, everybody. We have Ken Quiet Hawk to thank for that lovely intro, and you can find him and his amazing wife at nativestorytellers.com. They are native storytellers, obviously, and they have an amazing amount of material and information on their website, so please check it out. It is rather amazing. Mark has made magic happen this week, and he has Jason Jarrell back with us. Jason is amazing. His book, The Giants, about Native Americans here in this country, is probably the best documented and most interesting book I have read in a very, very long time. Highly recommend it to everybody. And he has new material that he's going to be sharing with us, as well as expanding upon old. And Mark is a good friend of his, so the two of them are going to enlighten us and give us a cornucopia of material to take into the holiday season. So I'm going to bring Mark on. Hi, Mark. How's it going tonight?
I'm fine. How are you doing?
Doing well. Doing very well. I'm excited about tonight's show.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be a good one. This is, we have all kinds of information to cover, from the archaic to Hopewell time period, and maybe even the Mississippian. It's going to be a cornucopia of everything.
I think that's what a cornucopia is.
Yeah. It's going to be a good one. But, glad, a little bit of stuff to go over. But I'm glad the three-legged donkey delivered Jason Sarah's mail yesterday before the freezing rain arrives, and because that's going to fit in with some of our discussion this evening. And you and I were talking last night at 12:01, and you did not say those three words. Not those three words, but the more familiar "you are fired."
But that all tough words.
Yeah. So the jinx is over, and we're here for I'm here for the third part of our quadrilogy on prehistoric shows. I think we can attribute the far more pleasant discussion last night to you being better educated and far more enlightened. So, good.
I'll take it.
Okay. But I won't segue into other things there. But you and I really enjoy studying ancient history, and not all of the really neat stuff is overseas. America has a lot of structures and customs that rival Stonehenge and the pyramids. And we're just
absolutely
discovering and rediscovering some of these fascinating mortuary practices and other mysteries. Jason is here to return to Nightlight to help us make sense of all this. Of course, we'll be discussing his book that he co-authored with his lovely wife, Sarah Farmer, and their book is entitled The Ages of the Giants. And their
it's a
works
great
can also
book.
Oh yeah, it really is. And let's see, their works can also be found in Ancient American Magazine. Just give Wayne a call. He needs to do some cardio, carrying all these orders down to the post office. But we're going to be covering a lot of information tonight. Let's see. We already had one caller, Amanda, and her birthday mister just leave a message, and they want to know if Sarah has gotten the billboard sign put up in Dunbar so that they can see it on their way to Pies and Pints.
Okay.
So, that's not the whole show, but I'm waiting. I'm trying to goad Sarah into joining us. Is she
Jason's not
listening?
Jason's
Jason,
his mic is open. Yeah.
Well, she's not joining us tonight, unfortunately. So you'll just have to make do with me. I don't know how much enlightenment I can bring, but I am kind of a scholar, so hopefully we can illuminate some interesting subjects together.
Okay, yeah. Jason, you brought so much attention to West Virginia's rich prehistory. How did the local historians respond to your Ancient Aliens appearance?
Well, first of all, when I agreed to do Ancient Aliens, I had a 2-hour-long conversation with the producers of the show, and I explained to them that I do not believe in extraterrestrial contact. And the reason that I would do the show in spite of that is there is certain evidence of certain discoveries here in the mounds in Charleston, West Virginia, where I live, that I wanted the whole world to be able to see. And they agreed to put the evidence on screen, and so I agreed to be interviewed by them. Now, what's very interesting about the situation is that the producers at that time were actually looking for something that was low on sensationalism. They wanted to speak with an expert on the Adena mound builders who was willing to talk about the very large skeletons found in some of the mounds. And I believe they were, for the most part, very respectful of those pretenses with the segment as it appeared on the show. It was very informative, and they actually showed their viewers pages from a copy that we own of the manuscript and field diary of the Smithsonian agent who in 1883 and 1884 removed multiple skeletons between 7 feet tall and 7 feet 6 inches in height from the burial mounds here in Charleston, West Virginia. But the really interesting thing surrounding this whole episode, which you had a hand in organizing, I might mention, Mark. This caver.
Don't let people know I'm competent. Barbara said, I'm just like to sit in the corner and be cute and fluffy and just like radio eye candy.
Well, I mean, the thing is, let me tell anyone hearing this, Mark Eddy is a force of nature. There are things that happen when this guy's around, okay?
I'm in trouble now.
We essentially set up to shoot on a certain day, and the local press found out that the show was coming to Charleston. They didn't know anything about it, why they were coming, what their interest was in the mounds, nothing. And what happened was they spoke with several archaeologists who then took it upon themselves to accuse the program and the guests, again, without knowing anything about the content. They accused everyone involved of being some type of cosmic racists who claimed the Indians couldn't have built the mounds without the help of extraterrestrials. So we experienced firsthand how the media and academia partner to sort of play whack-a-mole with the threat of any viewpoint, which goes against whatever it is that they're living in.
Okay, and this same mindset seems to be continuing, like 3 years later with, this, debunking of, what you do at a state museum. What did you think of the
information from the Grave Creek Mound Museum in Wheeling? Is it?
Moundsville.
Mm.
There is, like they say, there is no archaeological evidence for a race of giant humans.
Well, if we're going to address this, there's a lot to unpack, so I hope you've got a minute.
About an hour
2
and 50
hours.
minutes.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so I just want everyone to understand who I am and what I do before I talk about the controversial displays that are going up in our taxpayer-funded museums. Myself, I'm what you would call an avocational archaeologist. I study archaeology because I love it and because I love ancient cultures and the indigenous people of North America. And one of the benefits of not being a university-funded archaeologist is you're free to review archaeological reports and archaeological discoveries from throughout our country's history and talk about anything that you find interesting in those reports, including things which the establishment chooses to conveniently ignore. And one of the subjects which we've found is valid is the discovery of human beings of extraordinary size, height, and build that have been found in many prehistoric tombs throughout the country. Now, with regards to the types of displays that Grave Creek Mound Museum has put up, where we have the Cardiff giant and several known hoaxes and frauds mentioned, really has nothing to do with what was actually found in the mounds. Anytime that you see these classic stories or old newspaper stories that mention people 15 and 20 feet tall being found in ancient tombs, those stories were jokes, exaggerations, or frauds. The reality is that what has been found in the burial mounds of the Ohio River Valley, Adena and Hopewell cultures, what has been found from the earliest days of settlement in this region are the remains of people who range between 7 and 8.5 feet tall, with very thick bones, very powerful jaws, and clear markings on the bones for powerful muscular attachments. These remains have been found, measured, and photographed, not just by the Smithsonian in the 1880s, but by professional archaeologists all the way up to the 1980s in tombs of the Adena and Hopewell cultures, not just in the Ohio River Valley, but also in New York State, Delaware, Maryland, Vermont, southern Canada, and southeastern Florida. There are far too many of these remains found in a culture that spanned essentially around 800 years for us to just say that they were the occasionally tall members of a population. So that's the reality versus the hoax. And what we're seeing happen is obvious hoaxes are being used as examples of what people like myself are talking about, when that's a completely invalid and fraudulent comparison to make.
It's a little bit troubling to see this couple displays where they're just kind of trying to debunk giantology when the Crescent Mound was excavated in 1960, and it was located just 7 miles south of this museum. Can you explain the importance of the Crescent Mound? And
Certainly.
How this just it does. The findings don't match what is on display at the museum.
So the Crescent Mound was excavated by an archaeologist from the Carnegie Museum named Don Dragoo, and Dragoo's excavation and study of the Crescent Mound are the centerpiece of an excellent book published in 1963 called Mounds for the Dead by Don Dragoo. And the Crescent Mound is a very famous Adena mound. Almost every archaeologist knows about this mound and has to study it because it was Dragoo's research at Crescent Mound which revealed the information that gave us the chronology of the entire Adena culture. In other words, the stratified layers of the mound had artifacts which could be used to diagnose any of the phases that this culture went through time. And for archaeo junkies like myself, that's very interesting information. While excavating the Crescent Mound, Don Dragoo uncovered the remains of a very large individual in burial 54 at the mound, which was a skeleton that was just over 7 feet long. And Dragoo actually was inspired by this discovery to do a review of Adena anthropology, just as several anthropologists had done in the preceding decades. And so studying the surviving bones on catalog of the Adena people and comparing those bones with the bones that he found in the Crescent Mound, Don Dragoo was inspired to write a section of his book called The Physical Anthropology of Adena, which essentially acknowledges the consistent discovery of individuals of some extraordinary stature in the mounds of the culture. And there are several discoveries cited in that part of the book. So the mound is significant for a number of reasons. First of all, anyone who studies this culture knows about this mound, and so they know about Dragoo's statements concerning large individuals among the Adena people. That means that virtually every expert on this culture who denies that large bones were ever found fully knows better. But the other significant thing in relation to Grave Creek Mound is that its vicinity to Grave Creek and the Grave Creek Mound tells us that the same tribes of Adena people likely constructed both mounds. And it's very ironic in a lot of ways that a mound so close to Grave Creek yielded the evidence of precisely what the museum is working hard to deny today. But if you look, you mentioned giantology a minute ago. Mm-hmm. So if we think of giantology as a field of literature, documentaries, and other media that is themed upon the discovery of giants in prehistoric graves, which is what it is, if you look at the last 20 years of giantology, we've been inundated with books which basically link these large remains with various sensational concepts, such as the Nephilim, aliens, or some unknown race of humanity. So we shouldn't be surprised when the first encounter between academics and giantologists in modern times produces a situation like this. There are no two diametrically opposed fields with more distinction than any form of academic study and what we call giantology. The issue at hand is, of all the people who write about the giants, there are actually very few of them probably who could actually even identify a piece of pottery or a spear point fabricated by any of the cultures that buried the large skeletons in their tombs. So there's growth that needs to happen on both sides. There's a knee-jerk reaction from the establishment, and that's being agitated by connecting the discovery of these remains with very sensational ideas for which there's very little support.
Okay, I don't need to go to college and get a 4-year degree in anthropology to just look at page 50, and there is a photo of Burial 54.
Uh-huh.
It's clearly defined right there. There's photographic evidence of a giant that came out, or was published in 1963. That's pretty much case closed.
Well, the case is closed. That's the point, you see. When we read any kind of academic literature, even if it's genetic anthropology, you'll find that the experts in any scientific field, to back up any of the theories or conclusions they reach, they cite numerous other experts who have documented the same experiments and effects. And I'm not sure how many archaeologists and anthropologists that we found going back to the 1800s who acknowledged these large remains and measured them for our book, Ages of the Giants. But I know that each chapter ended up having to have its own reference section. The remains are already on record, as you say. The proof is already there. What we have here is an anthropological anomaly that no one wants to deal with. And because no one wants to deal with it, it's been picked up upon by a lot of different sources for different reasons that make the academics uncomfortable. And so there's a perfect tension that's generated by this issue.
And, this is what the Crescent Mound is considered more of an early Adena mound than, when Colonel Norris was in Dunbar, and you can go, was it like 18th Street, or maybe when Sarah gets the pink Speedo billboard up, she can have like directions of where the Smith Mound was located. And there were three giants in just that one mound. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of the Smith Mound? And that was what considered a late Adena mound, and so there's several hundred years of a giant presence in the greater Ohio River Valley.
Well, yes, there must be, and this is why. The Charleston Mound Group that you're referring to consisted of 50 burial mounds and between 8 and 10 sacred earthworks that were probably aligned to the sun and the moon. And this is the largest single Adena mound site in the entire Ohio River Valley that we know of. The Charleston mounds date back to around 200 BC, and they were during the later phase of the Adena culture. And during this phase, what had happened was multiple communities and villages, instead of building their own burial mounds, they had started to assemble together at one predetermined time and place, and to bury all of their dead together in large burial mounds, centers, as we see at Charleston. So what that tells us is that the Charleston Mound Group gives us a good perspective on a larger expanse of the Adena world in terms of what their people were like. In fact, this was probably used by Adena people who lived throughout the entire Kanawha River Valley, and they were bringing their dead here and burying them in the same mounds as the dead of other communities as a way of symbolically adopting a common ancestry in the world of the dead. This was a profound way to ensure economic ties and stability, because adopting the dead ancestors of another person's family made you the same family. So the cult of the dead was at the center of this sort of intercommunal alliance. And at Charleston, Colonel Norris of the Smithsonian Institution, between 1883 and 1884, unearthed numerous skeletons. Some are simply called, in his notes, gigantic or massive. When measurements were possible, he measured skeletons between 7 and 7 feet 6 inches in height. He recovered numerous skeletons of this size from the Charleston Mound Group, and as you said, at least 3 of the large individuals came from one mound, which was the Great Smith Mound. It was on the Smith Farm in what is now Dunbar, West Virginia. So with all of this information, that we've gone over in mind, what this tells us is that the large Adena people, the peoples that are known in the popular lingo today as the ancient giants, they were living among many Adena communities spread out throughout the Kanawha Valley. They were a consistent aspect of Adena populations, because as they died off in different areas, their remains were being transported to Charleston from different communities for burial at this particular mound group. So this was a widespread phenomenon among this population base.
Okay, and you have, like, one of my favorite aspects of the Smith Mound is it is one of three mounds that had basically a log cabin built inside of it, and the primary burial was inside this log cabin.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are several mounds at Charleston which covered wooden tomb structures, and during this particular phase of this culture, the tombs of the dead that we find in the mounds, they are elaborate log tombs, and sometimes they make what appear to be small cabins in which sometimes just one burial, but other times multiple burials are placed. At the Smith Mound, this was a log tomb with a sloping bark roof and even a ridge support, and the log tomb contained 6 burials. And one of those burials was a large skeleton, 7 feet 6 inches tall, that had been wrapped in leather and bark and encased in clay. Now, it's interesting to take the practice of encasing the dead in clay in Adena, because that is a widespread tendency. We see a lot of the Adena mounds actually had baked clay floors, which were probably ritual areas before the mound was built over top of it. The reason for the popularity of clay probably has something to do with the ancient Native American mythology of the first sacred earth taken from beneath the primordial ocean that was used to create the earth island that we all live on. And when it comes to the log cabins built into the Adena tombs, and of course they weren't literal log cabins, they were just cabin-like sometimes in form. When it comes to the larger log tombs, we could be seeing an ancient representation of what's known as a medicine lodge or a spirit house in historic Native American traditions. Because if there's one thing that's becoming more and more apparent as the years go on, it's that these cultures can be interpreted through the lens of Native American traditions, because they maintain the same cosmology here for tens of thousands of years unchanged. And we know a lot about that today.
It was an interesting point what you were saying about the use of clay, and if we at the Smith Mound, and if we look at the burial 54 from the Crescent Mound, what that might have been 200 or 300 years earlier. It's actually I always say it wasn't as a flamboyant type of burial. It was more of like a simplistic type burial. So
Right.
You can see, like, how some of the rituals changed over a few hundred years, and varied. The 200 miles or so between the two mound locations. That's an interesting point you brought up.
Well, the fact is, diversity is the key to understanding these cultures. There's very little that's repeated time and again with the burial practices, but those few things which provide us with a tantalizing glimpse into the belief systems of the mound builders. One of the mythologies that I've been working really hard to try to dispel lately is this idea that the ancient giants are unknowable to us, that these cultures are completely concealed from our knowledge, and so we have to speculate great narratives of history to try to explain the mound builders and the giants. Well, this simply isn't true because, as you know, the Adena and Hopewell cultures are two of the most widely studied ancient groups in the world. There are thousands and thousands of pages of breakthrough research published on these cultures every year. You can barely keep up with it. And so one of the things that I've tried to do and that Sarah tries to do as well is to really use this as a type of a jumping on point to teach people about these ancient cultures because they're extraordinary. Many years ago, I started my investigations into the ancient world by learning the archaeology of Europe and the Middle East. And then when I began studying the archaeology of North America, I realized that North America was unlike anything else in the ancient world. The history that we see here defies standard routines of human behavior that we see replicated throughout the rest of the world. North America really is the great mystery when it comes to archaeology.
And one of the points of the museum display that I don't know, it just maybe creates more confusion. I really am not sure about the statement, but they also say there's no archaeological evidence for a race of giant humans. Do you think that these, the three giants in the Smith Mound or the Crescent Mound, or I wouldn't get into the Dover Mounds? Do you think those examples are just unusually tall people? Do you think this is just the characteristic of this race or species of people? Were the giants different people? Or are we just talking, or should we just see them as just tall people, just like we have some tall basketball players today, or we have little people today? I mean, we have the same thing going on in today's world. But do you think that there is a separate race of giants?
There is no separate race of giants in ancient America. There is no separate race of giants. There was no Canaanite invasion that installed giant overlords ruling the Native American people that were later destroyed in a revolution, as some of the popular narratives are saying today. The giants were in the ancestry of all Native Americans. The giants cannot be genetically linked to any one specific tribe or linguistic group. In the eastern woodlands, the ancestors of at least 5 different major linguistic groups had the giants among them. The giants were a product of the Native American gene pool as it had been since at least 15,000 years ago when the first people came into this part of the world. And in order to determine the true significance of why these types of people exist among the Native American people, would require us to peer further into the past and look closer at genetic anthropology than we've been willing to do up to this point. Whatever the answer to this mystery is, it's going to be found in anthropology somewhere. And the fact is, people talk about a quest for unusual DNA today. We have all these strange remains from around the world that are being passed through DNA labs. Well, even with a cursory knowledge of genetic anthropology, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you now, we don't even know what most of the stuff in our DNA that we already know about is for. I mean, the DNA is still a major mystery to us. And yet we think that we can go and find something unusual that's out there waiting to be found. Well, humans are already a great mystery. There's much that we don't know about human history, human origins. There's so much that we don't know already that the answer to some of these questions could just be waiting to be found. And the issue is that no one's cracked it yet. But in terms of who were they, our first book, Ages of the Giants, was written to document the hard archaeological evidence that backs up this story. And our next book is going to answer several of the questions that people have been asking us since the first book came out. And one of those questions is, who were they and who are their descendants today? And the information that we've collected, although I can't say much about it right now, the information that we've collected, I believe, is going to shed more light on that subject than many people have anticipated. So, with that said, no, they're not a separate race or a separate species. For whatever reason, they seem to have been born into the basic population. And we know also that they were not guaranteed some type of elite status on the virtue of their unique descent, because we see tombs which contain the large remains when the individual is buried with no artifacts whatsoever, sometimes face down. And then on the other hand, we have tombs where a large individual is buried with many prestigious artifacts, smoking pipes, exotic materials such as copper and mica. But the fact is that there were just as many, and in fact more people who seem to have had authority who were of average stature than there were people who were drawn from the genetic base of the tall ones.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because I didn't know. I just don't know. But if people can read, Dr. Webb's The Dover Mound, and he does say, the people buried at the Dover Mound are not all. There's only one giant, but most of the other people buried at the Dover Mound are a little taller than the rest of the population. It does seem like there were some, a little bit like, say, closer like 5'10", a little closer to 6 feet tall than like 5'6". You just kind of wonder about these issues with height. It is just a fascinating topic, and then the story. The similar stories have continued to be passed on in folklore, and it is the display at the museum that kind of puts down folklore, but it's backing up what the archaeologists have found. So it's just kind of bewildering for just the average person to understand this material.
Well, that's a bias of American archaeology, actually. The archaeologists in the northeastern woodlands here in the United States have a historic bias against Native American traditions and folklore and trying to use them in actual archaeological discoveries and digs. And that's something that we've only recently started to break out of, where we see people like Cheryl Clausen and Christopher Carr and Will Romaine who are applying Native American traditions to interpreting these cultures. But that's still that's new ground in American archaeology today for that to become a standard. Whereas if you cross the border into Canada, you'll find that burial mounds of the Adena culture that are 3,000 years old have actually been located because their descendants in the same area passed on the tradition that it was a burial mound for 3 millennia, and then they contact the archaeologists. So there's a completely different relationship between archaeologists, not just between countries, but different states and the Native Americans, and I think that really affects how much we trust the lore or how much individual academics trust in the lore. But the Native American cosmology and folklore really deserves a place in world mythology that I believe that it's denied the status that it fully deserves, because the narrative traditions that were recorded from the Native American elders after European contact, they describe cosmologies and mythologies that are just as fascinating and incredible as anything else from the ancient world.
Okay. Now that you brought up these cosmology stories, you do have a really interesting article in Ancient American edition 120 where you talk about these, like the where mounds are located near marshes. You get like you say like a floating island imagery. Well, okay, that can go back to Indian Knoll when the Green River would flood, and the burial mound would look like an island.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just but you work in these marshes and the cosmology. Let's get into what you found about the positioning of the mounds.
Well, to begin with, it's important to view North American history this way. For tens of thousands of years, the Native American people and their ancestors held the same cosmological model, the same way of seeing the universe. And this model, there are numerous variations of it, but I'll just give you the basics. In this model, the cosmos consists of 3 realms. Now, there's a realm above us. We'll just call that the above realm, and it's inhabited by powerful beings known as thunderbirds. we, ourselves as humans, animals, plants, the natural world, as we call it, represent the second realm beneath the sky realm, and our world is usually imagined as a flat disk or island floating in a primordial expanse of ocean, water. Now, beneath our world, there's a watery underworld known as the below realm or other realm, and here in the underworld, there's a race of creatures who usually are depicted as serpent-like, and they have a master that is over them, a great and powerful spiritual being called the Great Horned Serpent or the Underwater Panther. And there are several different permutations of how this being is portrayed on artifacts, rock art, paintings, and other types of expression. But essentially, most forms of this being in the Native American lore are either a gigantic serpent with horns or a serpentine dragon-like being with a body very similar to a feline, sometimes with a long tail covered in copper or shell. Now, the beings in the above realm, the thunderers, and the beings from the below realm, led by the great horned serpent, are in constant warfare. And their war transpires in our world, and humans make alliances with either or both of these forces. This cosmology may be as old as humanity itself, because we're finding echoes of it in the Upper Paleolithic period today. Now, uniting the three realms was a pillar or mountain. It's usually known as an axis mundi. And this axis mundi is what was intended by the construction of conical burial mounds. They were artificial portals connecting the three realms. And since one of those realms is represented by water, and since the earth disk is surrounded by water, the ancients took to building their sacred shrines and burial grounds along waterways or near lakes, because waterways and lakes and streams and natural springs were believed to lead straight into the watery underworld, because all the realms were connected and they interrelated with each other.
And a lot of that article in edition 120 focuses on the Liverpool site in central Illinois, and really in a lot of these areas where there are mounds, it's fairly common to have creeks emptying into a major river, and water just kind of pools up around the creates a little estuary. You do find mounds in those areas, pretty common. So it's like this cosmology seems like it would be a pattern throughout a pretty expansive part of the eastern United States.
Well, it was, and frequently there have been mounds in Illinois and Minnesota constructed by Hopewell-related people that were built deliberately in floodplains, because the submergence of the mound underwater and then its re-emergence later represented the submergence and rebirth of the world, of the island, as it was pulled from the primordial sea. So it's the sky's the limit with how much of an influence the presence of water played on the construction of burial mounds and earthworks for these people. Water was very important because every waterway was viewed as being a habitation for the great horned serpent. Even in historic times, the Indians of the Northeast were still sacrificing tobacco before taking any water voyage in this part of the country because they believed that the great serpents could cause drownings and canoe accidents. So this is a very prevalent cosmology. We find it in the traditions of the Pawnee. We find it among the Iroquois, the Sioux, the Algonquians, and there's a remarkable similarity in the traditions of all these people concerning these spirit beings like the thunderbirds or the great serpents and the tiered cosmos that they lived in. But there's also an important distinction I would like to make about this belief system. I've used terms such as spirits or spirit beings to describe the thunderbirds and the great horned serpents, and so have many ethnographers and researchers. But I just want people to understand that the Western understanding for spirit being or supernatural does not apply to the Native American cosmology in any way, shape, or form. In this belief system, the thunderers and the great horned serpents and the worlds in which they live are simply extensions of our world. They are literally true. They're not figurative, but literal.
Jason?
Mm-hmm.
It's Barbara.
Yeah.
I have a question. You're talking about a horned serpent, and it just occurred to me that the Mayan people actually did come from this part of the country, and they had, of course, a feathered serpent also. Is there any connection or overplay? They do kind of hit the same time frame, kind of.
All of the cosmologies and traditions of this entire part of the world are linked because all of these people came from the same ancestral base. And I know that there are new DNA studies that have been published that suggest that there were several waves of colonists into North America more than 10,000 years ago. But even with that, that still wouldn't change the circulation of the mythologies. And there are actually anthropologists that have published studies that reference Quetzalcoatl and some of the serpent beings we see south of the border in the iconography there, and compare it to the concept of the great serpent here in the eastern woodlands. Yes, in my opinion.
I wonder how much of this comes from genetic memory with the overflow rather than actually even a connection of it. You know, could it be that deeply into the DNA?
Well, the archetypes of the unconscious are a powerful thing, so certainly any interpretation is possible when we're talking about ancient cultures and people. The only difference is that some are more likely. But when it comes to considering whether or not the pervasiveness of this particular myth, when it comes to that, I think it could be cultural transmission or genetic memory. In fact, if we look around the entire world, we see these motifs. For instance, the Norse concept. You know, we have a god of thunder, Thor, that at the apocalypse does battle with a great serpent from beneath a watery abyss at the pillars of the earth. During the Ragnarok, this concept is identical to the thunderbirds battling the great horned serpents for the fate of the earth disk. So it's very widespread. It could be genetic memory, and yet sometimes I'm tempted to think that we may be getting glimpses of a very, very ancient form of belief that was at one time common to the ancestors of all humanity.
Well, you want to take it back to when it was just one plate, and therefore all of us had the same language and everything, and then as the plates shifted, then differences because of climate and everything else took us in other directions. I kind of every now and then play with the idea that there was a commonality originally, if you go back far enough in time, that was shaped by the environment and all sorts of other things over huge periods of time that have created the differences. Because there are similar creation stories if you go into the different tribes, and then you hit Europe, and you hit Asia, and you hit India and China. They all have similar creation stories at the very core. Of course, they weave different names and stuff like that, but basically creation stories of the flood. There are similarities all over the world throughout all of time. So you get to the point where you think, are we coming back to a time where we are all beginning to blend into one again, or will the differences remain the same and keep us apart?
Well, I think that one way to look at this phenomenon of comparative mythology is a fascinating subject. And I think that, though, when we look at the cosmology that we just went over with the three realms and the thunderers and the serpents and the earth disk, I think that we're looking at a model, and within that model, numerous religions could exist no matter how similar or different they were. For example, if we look at the religions of the book, Christianity and Islam and Judaism are dramatically different. They have the same heroes. They use the same scriptures. Their temples are even very similar in some ways. However, the religion that exists within those trappings are very different. So the cosmology of the mound builders could have been the host of many different types of religions, and it's possible if we look at the religions of the world, of all throughout history, I think we would find a lot of similarities if we strip them down to the bare model. And I think that model, if we strip them down to the model, in other words, how was the universe structured? Where do we find good and evil? Things like that. If we strip them down to the bare model, that's where we'll find the great commonalities we're looking for.
Oh, so there is truth to the folklore then?
Do you're referring to Native American folklore?
Oh, I just love it. I'm just saying that the display at the
yes,
Mountain Museum says just really marginalizes folklore, and here we are talking about.
Well, that's an attitude, Mark, I'm sure that you've felt this many times in your own pursuit of truth. Everyone's experience is different, but one thing, what you're seeing is the attitude of our age, where we've gotten to the point where we believe that because an institution gives us a permit to study a subject, that we can do away with all the traditions that came before us. We come out of the universities convinced that all the wisdom of ages past was something to wink at, almost like a bad joke. And we're here to illuminate the picture. We're here to make things better. But when I look back on our ancestors, I have to ask if we are making things better. I have to ask, was it the right thing to do to throw away the ancestral past in favor of pure scientism? Because that's what's happening. If anyone is interested in studying Native American cosmology and folklore. I highly recommend it because there is a wealth of fantastic knowledge to be found in it.
Well, and great wisdom too. I mean, when the colonists came, when the pilgrims came, when we invaded their land, we didn't in any way take into consideration that they might have a spirituality that was far and above what we had, or we didn't even take the time to recognize that they had a spirituality, a connection to the earth, a connection to all of the natural, the wind and everything, and we assumed that they were barbarians instead of a highly cultured race of people.
Well, you have to understand that Westerners are incapable of understanding paleo-spirituality, and there's a really good reason for that. By the first millennium A.D., the Mother Church had concluded and demanded that the spiritual and the physical realms were not the same. It was the church that created the great divorce between religion and science when it decided to go with Plato's concept of what the supernatural must be. In other words, a supernatural entity or spirit must be an intangible cloud that seeks to influence or interact with us from another world, the so-called spiritual world. Now, by the time Europeans came into North America, this was the general perspective on religion. And when they arrived here, they encountered a people for whom the spiritual and physical worlds were one. It was impossible for them to understand the religion, the traditions of the Indians, because these two people, the Europeans and the Native Americans, existed in two completely separate paradigms of reality.
Well, that's true. Go, Mark.
I was just going to follow up. Barbara's comment about the wisdom of the ancients, and my comment at the beginning of the show about at least the donkey finally made it to Charleston with a package for Jason. But if he's had a chance to read the article, and there's a passage on page 145 about these magical plants were necessary for communal health and cohesion, and that did work because it's pretty much a cohesive culture for 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years or longer. We aren't able to do that today. So there was a lot of wisdom that kept people together for a very long time.
Well, when we look at, just in our book, there's about 4,000 years of culture history mapped in our book. And during that 4,000 years, the cultures, they transformed, they changed their shape, but their ideology remained the same. Mm-hmm. Their cosmology remained the same. And that's quite a feat until you consider that these people felt themselves to be joined together by a supernatural force. For example, archaeologists talk about the exchange network and all of the exotic objects that found their way into Ohio. at this time, just over 2,000 years ago, and they struggled to understand what exactly it was that people in Ohio were exporting to get all this copper and different types of prestigious objects sent to them in Ohio so that it could be buried with them in their elaborate tombs. And today there is zero agreement on what the social hierarchy was for the mound builders at that time. We know they didn't have chiefs because there were no chiefs in North America until around 1000 A.D. We know that it wasn't just an exchange network either, because all of these items were religiously charged. As they passed objects from the Great Lakes into Ohio, there was a religious power, a spiritual power in that object. So it wasn't simple economy as we understand it today. The religion, like you said, had somehow been ingrained in the very perceptions of the people who participated in it, and it stayed that way for generations.
Okay. Go ahead. Fascinating response. And we're already.
Can I hop in just a second?
Yeah,
too,
sure.
Because when you consider how integrated the people were with their environment and how they were able to use their environment for healing and all sorts of other things, and that we dismissed it. And I mean, a terrific example is the SEACT that is absolutely used with cancer patients now and eases their pain and eases, and in many cases actually even helps to cure the cancer, depending on where it is and stuff like that. I mean, that SEACT was given to this nurse in 1940s, 1930s, and she had over 5,000 documented cures. She was changing the dressing on a native woman's a wound, and she saw a scar, and she said, "What's that?" And she said, "Oh, that's from where I had cancer." And she said, "What do you mean you had cancer?" And she said, "Yeah, it was cured with this tea that the chief gave us." And the tea is, I mean, it's used to this day. Of course, the government doesn't want you to use it, but I mean, they had cures for things that we're still looking for the cure for.
That's right, and I'm really, really pleased that you brought this up. This is a subject that's near and dear to my own heart. First of all, the societies that we're talking about, their healing, their knowledge of plants and their environment came from their shamans. Mm-hmm. And the Adena mound builders, their shamans, and the ritual leaders also of the later Hopewell, we now understand that in their smoking pipes, they were probably consuming a tobacco known as Nicotiana rustica. And Nicotiana rustica is the most powerful tobacco known. It contains nicotine concentrations exceeding 18%. Most cigarettes only have 1.2%. Nicotiana rustica is now known to produce experiences identical to those of known hallucinogens and psychoactive alkaloids, including ibogaine and harmaline. So at the point that we see the smoking pipes, which have tested positive for traces of nicotine, at the point that we see them introduced into the archaeological record in this part of the country, it is precisely the same time that the most exotic artifacts representing this cosmology and the great earthworks of the Ohio River Valley were constructed. By 200 BC, they had added psychoactive mushrooms to their repertoire because we have found a copper rod with a Hopewell shaman in southern Ohio with a mushroom effigy on the end of the rod that has been identified with one of the most potent hallucinogenic mushrooms in this part of the country. So altered states of consciousness were probably a major factor in what generated the mound building tradition here in the Ohio River Valley. One of the things, though, that the academics may not be considering when it comes to the use of the psychoactive plants is the impact that it can have on community relations. If the people already had a cult of the dead, which was thousands of years old, which meant that they had common divine ancestors, and then they started to share in the psychoactive tobacco in their pipe ceremonies at their gatherings, it could explain how hunter-gatherers assembled in such numbers to build an archaeological site like the Newark earthworks, which covered over 4 square miles, with precise alignments to the moon's 18.6-year cycle. There was a great deal of cooperation at this time period, and almost all of it seems to have gone purely to the expression of the cosmos.
It's amazing.
And they did all that without Obamacare.
They were hunter-gatherers. And this is why I believe we have so much to learn from them. They were an incredible people who accomplished remarkable things, but they did it without mechanics or the internet. And the general theory of anthropology that's been prevalent in the university circuits for a very long time is that without a centralized power, such as a king or a dictator, people don't do great things. You can see this in the fact that even today, archaeologists and anthropologists around the world insist that ancient Sumeria was the world's first civilization. Well, let me ask you, do you find debt servitude, warfare, and big agra to represent civilization? Because that's what ancient Sumeria was.
And we really don't find a whole lot of that here in the United States.
No, because the Adena and Hopewell mound builders, for all intents and purposes, appear to have been largely heterarchical. Without having a hierarchy, they were still able to organize and accomplish spectacular things. The Newark earthworks, for example, and I'm no archaeoastronomer, but the actual professional archaeoastronomers insist that it's more accurate than Stonehenge. When the alignments of the Newark earthworks were planned, it happened hundreds of years before they were built, when the Hopewell archaeoastronomers found natural alignments among the naturally occurring hills surrounding Newark. When they found those alignments, they then constructed the earthworks inside of them in order to add to the cosmological significance of the site, and the entire process took many generations. So clearly, the people here were sophisticated in ways that I don't believe the public outreach is really doing justice.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to have a editor on in the spring who will be able to talk about one of the contributions for an upcoming 2-part series, and one of the chapters covers archaeoastronomy, and this author has written about Mr. Hobley has written about the earthworks are so precise. There is only like an eighth of an inch off on some of the embankment. People can't even do that today with GPSs and lasers.
Are you having him on your show?
Hopefully, Jared will be on to discuss this book. I'd like. I'll ask him if he.
Hively and Horn are the people who discovered these alignments at Newark, and they are profound alignments. The Newark Earthworks, located in Licking County, Ohio, a massive Hopewell earthworks complex with so many precise lunar alignments that Hively and Horn, the archaeoastronomers who discovered it, concluded that the people were seeking to understand or harness the force represented by the moon. And this is something we see replicated in several major earthwork sites in Ohio, including High Bank and the Hopeton earthworks. So there's something special about the moon to these ancient mound builders.
I'll work on developing that one as we get closer to that 2-volume set that's coming out. I would like to promote their research, but it's the distances you're talking about are vast distances. You even get was it like Sugarloaf Mountain to the Adena Mansion? Like, we're talking like miles, and all this stuff is all lining up precisely. You mentioned those huge earthworks in Charleston, like the 9 sacred circles. Like, the diameters of those were like 1,000 feet.
Well, the Adena sacred circles are usually around 200 feet in diameter. What we now know is that the Adena and Hopewell both used the same measurement unit when they constructed their earthworks. It's a unit of 1,054 feet. And Hively and Horn discovered that by measuring the observatory circle at the Newark earthworks. And what's interesting is that Hopewell people seem to have preferred to use the measurement unit in its entirety in multiples, whereas the Adena would divide the unit and then use some division of it in the diameters of their earthworks. This is all very complicated business, and I would encourage anyone interested in checking out some of the alignments of these earthwork sites to pick up something by Hively and Horn or Will Romaine, who's done some excellent publications on the astronomical alignments of the Adena and Hopewell temples. These people were experts at tracking the sun and the moon, and in some cases, they spent generations tracking the moon around a certain vicinity just to build earthworks which aligned to important positions that it would follow during its cycle.
Archaeology of the Sacred is one of the books you and I would highly recommend by William Romaine.
Yes.
That's a good one.
Yeah, anyone who's interested in studying the cultures that we're talking about today, you do yourself a favor and pick up something by Christopher Carr or Will Romaine, and you'll learn a lot.
And Bill has Chapter 8, Ancient Skywatchers of the Eastern Woodlands, in the new book, Archaeology and Ancient Religion in the American Mid-Continent. And hopefully we'll have some of the authors from that book coming up soon. We're working on that. But there's another one of Bill's titles. We've gone through almost 3/4 of the show, which I just can't believe how much time passed by so quickly. Is Sarah still working on photoshopping the pink Speedo photo?
I'm not sure. That's one of her Black Ops projects that I have no.
Okay.
I'm maintaining my innocence by keeping my hands clean of this project of yours.
Okay. Well, I'm sure I'm going to hear about that.
Well, like I said, everyone, things happen when Mark Eddy comes around. So.
We've been talking a lot about these major river valleys. You also delve into some of these like mound clusters that are more located along tributaries, like the Doddridge County mound cluster that had a giant and
well, that's an interesting story.
Sutton's, these the position is unusual for these mounds. Can you tell us a little bit about that cluster?
Well, the mounds are the Doddridge County mounds probably began as very early Adena mounds and then were used over time. They're the position in the landscape is we see a lot of the very early Adena mounds that'll be in either a single mound or a small group, and then later there were later burials added to those mounds. But I think that the thing about the Doddridge County Mound Group, also known as the Ernest Sutton Mounds, among those of us that know what was found there, is that the excavator, Ernest Sutton, who was a local professor, he actually found very large skeletal remains in the mounds more than once in the same mound group. He found a large skeleton in the late 20s, I believe, and it was taken by one of his assistants. The assistant took it home with him and kept the skeleton. And later, the Smithsonian sent agents to interview Ernest Sutton to find out what had happened to the gigantic skeletons that Sutton had told the media he found in the mound. And Sutton explained to the Smithsonian agents that he didn't have the bones, and he did not know where the bones were. But I've seen a letter in which a discussion was taking place between Sutton and the assistant who took the bones, which made it very clear that at the time the Smithsonian was asking questions, the bones were still on hand somewhere, but they were later stolen. The second instance was in 1960. The same mound was excavated, and again, an assistant stole a large skeleton from the mound, and we did an investigation on this story, and we learned from people who lived in the area that when the person who had stolen the second giant found in the mound died, the skeleton was purchased on the black market. So there's actually monetary gain in unusual remains today, which really shouldn't surprise us, considering how many people are filming themselves holding Paracas skulls today and getting a good amount of attention for it. But there's a long history of those Doddridge County mounds and some of the fantastic discoveries made there. And I just wanted to say that Ernest Sutton himself was one of the pioneers in the archaeology of this region, and he's never really been recognized as such because he wasn't from the same old good old boys club as the establishment. But we are planning the publication of a book that is going to talk about Ernest Sutton's life and his contributions to archaeology in this part of the country to try to set the record straight.
Cool. Do you have an idea when that might be available?
It's among the projects that we plan to have finished in 2019. So that's it's something that we've actually been working on for several years and working with his family on to set the record straight on his contributions, because Sutton was overshadowed by state-sponsored institutions like the Ohio Historical Society, and we just feel that his work needs to be properly presented, and some of the extraordinary things he found need to be discussed in some depth. You can read a lot about Ernest Sutton in an article that we published online called The Giants of Doddridge County. You don't want to miss that one if you found any of the things we talked about today interesting.
Okay, and we're just under a half hour left, and I don't think we've mentioned your website yet. Do you want to give that a plug?
Sure. The website is paradigmcollision.com, and we have a lot of free articles and different things like that you can check out on the website. And the title of our book is Ages of the Giants, and you can find that on lulu.com. That's LULU.com.
Okay. And you are going to have another really captivating article coming out next month in Ancient American Magazine, and you get into these the magicians and their assistants, and that's another pattern that you bring up like 4 examples found across the Ohio River Valley, and it just kind of fits into a lot of these other patterns, cultural patterns that we've examined tonight. So let's give everyone a little preview of what to expect in your soon-to-be published article.
Well, sure. One of the people whose work has had the biggest impact on me, just as a thinker when I consider what I'm looking at with an archaeological site, is Christopher Carr. His books on the Hopewell go into great detail of the ways that we can use our knowledge to interpret the burials we see in the mounds. And there's actually a recurring type of burial in Adena mounds which span the entire length of the culture, from 500 BC to 300 AD. There's a recurring pattern of shaman burials who have females buried in the same tombs with them, but with no artifacts. And I don't think that the repetition of this type of burial has ever really been pointed out. I think that there are many types of burials in the mounds. There are thousands of burials on record from the mounds, and so a lot of things inevitably slip through the cracks. But we found that this was a recurring pattern in several Adena mounds in the Ohio Valley. And we offer, in the new article, we'll be offering our interpretation of who that female may have been and why she was significant. Why was this female burial placed in the tomb of a shaman? And it takes us to some pretty interesting places. In particular, we talk about the roles that oracles or mediums could have played in the Adena culture, because we know that the Adena people, in some instances, curated the remains of their ancestors for an unknown length of time, and then eventually someone would die who would be buried with the skull of someone who could have been a great-great-grandfather. So the cult, being so focused on ancestral connections and ties, we believe that this type of interpretation could be valid in this instance. But
Can I offer you a suggestion too?
Yes.
When it comes to the oracles of Delphi, who were mediums, sort of. They sat over the vapors and they went into a trance of some sort, and they would be given questions, and they would babble whatever came to them or through them. Often it was nonsensical, and it took a priest or magician to interpret it for the person who had asked the question. Mm-hmm. Could that same sort of pairing be appropriate for what you're talking about?
Well, you must be reading my mind, because that's exactly where the article goes. In fact, there's a lot of information in here about the oracle at Delphi, because in essence, what the oracle was is a shamanic practitioner who was in an institutionalized setting.
Yep.
They put a person in an altered state of consciousness in a way that was very ancient and very primitive, and then they used the things that person said or that they did to make important decisions that affected the entire ancient world. So in that instance, you could say that ancient Greece never could shake off its shamanic heritage. For all of their democracy and their love of reason, at the end of the day, it took a shamanic person to give them anything they're willing to listen to.
Well, and they had to put them into a trance so that they didn't even know what they were saying.
And that's a theory that the gas, there was a gas, an intoxicating gas that rose up through the crevice that oracle was seated over, and whoever controlled what she said controlled the fate of the entire Greek world, because as we know now, entire empires rose and fell based on the utterances of the Pythia.
Yeah.
And the possibility exists, considering the widespread use of hallucinogenic tobacco and probably other plants among the cultures we're studying, that this person may have been ritually exposed to a consciousness-altering substance and then used as an oracle medium.
Yeah, and I could see why if the magician passed away, that they would also bury with him the person that worked with him, was paired with him.
Well, and the fact is, we know that many of the Adena tombs were left open for an unknown period of time, and people may have been grouped into those tombs as time passed. So we don't necessarily have to have an instance of human sacrifice here either. The probability is if the shamans had female assistants who served as oracle mediums, that person would have been considered very potent with power, and burial of that person with a shaman may have been seen as a form of soul release. not to mention the connection that person would have been perceived as having with the shaman if they both experienced other than human entities or altered states together.
Yeah, I could see that. Interesting.
And Jason, just to keep the audience intrigued by this information, and like the Dover Mound book, as well as Dr. Webb's Adena People #2. There is good bit of information about these, like wolf jaws that were put in the magician's mouth, and like some of the costumes.
Sure.
That's some really neat stuff too that you bring up as well.
Well, the Adena Shamans are like my favorite band. I've studied them, every shred of material on them that I possibly can, because I believe that the leaders of these societies must have been incredible people. The Adena Shamans wore animal masks made from the actual skulls or jaws of the wildcat, the wolf, and the bear. And in some cases, they wore costumes which reflected other elements of those animals. There's the Panther Man shaman from the Dover Mound, who was buried with one of the female magician's assistants, wore a leather costume with crescent-shaped mica stripes, as well as the jaws of a puma over his face. This individual probably assumed the state or the being of a spirit animal while smoking the Nicotiana rustica tobacco, and it was the merger of the man and the animal which made it possible to journey between the different realms in the ancient cosmos that we discussed earlier. So the Adena shamans seem to have been focused primarily on emulating those three animals, the wolf, the wildcat, and the bear, although there are some very interesting findings from different mounds that could indicate that there were mythic creatures that they sometimes impersonated also. I have an entire chapter in my next book about that, some of the mythic beasts that the Adena shamans may have been imitating, but which people just didn't recognize the costumery for what it was at the time of the excavation. So these were the people who, in altered states, would have traveled along the axis mundi, uniting worlds, and brought back knowledge to be used for their community's benefit upon returning to our realm.
Okay, and Jason, go back to one of the original themes of the show is the display at the Delft Nerona Museum, where they talk about pseudo archaeology, and just kind of focuses on just one artifact, and it's kind of taken out of context, and they develop this theory over. Well, I think probably all the examples we've given are just aren't one based on one artifact. We've looked at these patterns, what many like museum curators have uncovered, like 50, 60 years ago. Well, then we get into the 1880s with Colonel Norris, but this was all long before Eric von Daniken. So we aren't. I don't think we've really fallen into the pattern that's the display case is suggesting that what we're doing tonight is that we're part of the problem.
Well, the fact of the matter is this: as we documented in our book, the tall ones, the giants, their remains have been reported from the glacial Kame culture that dates to between 1400 BC and 700 BC. Then we find them reported in the mounds of the Adena and Hopewell, which together span 1000 BC to 500 AD. Then we find there are just as many gigantic skeletons in the mounds of the Mississippian culture, which persisted until around 1600 AD after European contact, and in fact several large skeletons between 7 and 8 feet tall that were unearthed by the Smithsonian and archaeologists in recent times were found with Spanish trade artifacts. We now know beyond a shadow of a doubt that not only did the tall ones persist throughout all of North American prehistory, but that they were still living and still being buried in mounds after European contact to within just a few hundred years ago. And if we're going to deny the existence of people with this anthropology, we're doing something very foolish. Because at the end of the day, not only are they real, but they're also very human, and they're Native American people.
Excellent point. Okay. When do you think your part 2 is going to be out? The Ernest Sutton book coming out next year. What can we anticipate from you and Sarah in the upcoming year?
Up to now, our goal with our publications has been to show people the archaeological evidence. And I think we've done that. I think we've done a fairly good job of that. Now we're going to interpret the evidence with the next phase, and beginning with the articles that we have about to be published at the present, and continuing into 2019, we will publish the sequel to Ages of the Giants, and we will also be publishing a detailed description of Ernest Sutton's archaeological explorations in the Ohio Valley. Those two projects are both planned for 2019. But you know what they say about plans. But that's what we have on the agenda. The follow-up to our first book is going to try to answer 3 major questions about the ancient giants that, as far as I know, have never been satisfactorily answered. Among those questions are, where did they come from? What is their genesis? Why were they gifted the way they were with a unique anthropology? The other question is, who are their living descendants? And then finally, we're going to discuss at least one instance where we have found hard evidence that one of the Native American stories of a battle between a tribe and a group of giants that we've all heard so many times, we have found that at least one of these stories can now be backed up with hard evidence. And we even have a date for when the encounter probably happened, and we've identified what we believe are the languages spoken by both sides. So these are the types of things that we'll be addressing in the book that's coming out next year.
Wow. Okay, sounds like going to have a busy year, and hopefully get you on more radio shows and hear more of your information. And we've covered so many topics tonight, and I think the audience really should be just overwhelmed with what the 5,000 years of history you masterfully covered. And as we approach, like 9 minutes left in the show, I think one of the fascinating aspects of Ages of the Giants, and what should be apparent from so many of these discussions or the topics tonight, is the role of the interconnected river valleys play in the ancient people's lives. And information's going up and down the rivers all the time. One of the interesting mounds that you analyze is the North Benton Mound, and then further north in
absolutely
northeast of Ohio's North Benton Mound, you have like the Squawky Hill culture. Maybe do like a quick synopsis of those cultures, and then we'll probably be cut off by the English robo-babe.
No,
Okay,
by me, probably.
We've talked about the Adena and Hopewell cultures in the Ohio Valley tonight, but the fact is these cultures spread all around the country. And by Hopewell times, the mound builder tradition that we're discussing today had spread to the Florida coast in the south, and it was in southern Ontario and all along the Atlantic coast, and their exchange network reached as far as the Rocky Mountain range, where they were acquiring their obsidian. And the river valleys were the natural highways. It's a remarkable thing when we consider today that our natural instinct is to build bridges over rivers, and it seems that the ancients were trying to let the rivers lead them to places. And they established a remarkable exchange network. It's truly incredible. It had probably been in place since archaic times, more than 3,000 years ago, because we know that the shell mound people that are 6,000 or 7,000 years old were importing copper from the Great Lakes. So the river valleys were sort of the glue that held their society together. And the way these cultures spread, though, I don't believe it was simple trade. Many archaeologists today will look at a culture in Vermont, which is the material culture, the pipes, the points, all these different elements that we find in the graves will be identical to what we see in Ohio in an Adena burial mound, and they'll say that those pipes were just traded, that those material goods were just traded, and somehow the religion accompanied the object. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think these people were united in lasting, interconnected ways that we just haven't found anything in the terminology that really accounts for it. We're supposed to think of primitive humans as isolated cave dwellers who can barely do anything for themselves, but it seems that, again, North America stands out as a place where remarkable things happen among people without a hierarchy and without city building or any of the things we deem necessary to human economy.
Okay. Well, we're down to about 5 minutes. I think you and Sarah need to come up and and give you a tour of like where the Half Moon Mound Cluster stood, and it's kind of across the river from Dave Hunt's house. But Dave will appreciate that I acknowledged him. He's a big supporter of the show. But you need to come up and see some of the stuff, and it's hopefully we can get together soon. And since the leaves are off the trees, you can see more. So hopefully we can do something like that.
Yeah, that would be fun. I'd also like to inform the Grave Creek Mound Museum that in order for a tax-funded, state-funded public outreach to put up an exhibit that attacks a viewpoint held by some American citizens is probably illegal. But that's one reason why people who are interested in doing this type of research need to understand their rights and the legalities that are supposed to be applied to anything that's tax-funded or state-funded. State-funded institutions have no right to bar anyone from having access to anything in their collections who happens to be an American citizen, and they certainly should not be setting up displays that only exist to attack certain viewpoints. That doesn't make me feel very comfortable when I think about that happening in the United States of America.
Yeah, I just encourage people go tour the museum, go see it. It's unfortunate that that's going up, but go in for a visit, buy a T-shirt. It's just, I don't. I thought it was done in poor taste. And I guess maybe they aren't going to step on my First Amendment rights about saying that, but I just really didn't appreciate seeing what they did with my tax dollars and kind of making what we do for the magazine and other publications. It's making us look ridiculous. They're doing the same thing to themselves.
Yes, well, you just have to always remember, and this is advice for anyone out there, you can't stop people from doing bad things. The most important thing in the universe, though, is what you do yourself. At the end of the day, the best that we can hope to do is try to balance ignorance with knowledge, to balance the darkness by bringing some light. And you can only do what is within your spirit to do. However, it may be time in our country's history for some type of for a legal challenge to be brought against the hoarding of prehistoric artifacts and information that we see happening with tax-funded institutions, which then want to limit who can have access to their acquisitions or whose viewpoint is welcome in their centers. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about taxation without representation.
Excellent point.
Well, I got to tell you, you came up at the very, very end with some very good advice and some wise thoughts. We are down to the last 10 or 15 seconds, so we have to say goodnight. But, Jason, this has been an amazing show. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for putting up with me.
It's time, Mark, to say goodnight.
Sarah, keep working on that billboard. We're all looking forward to seeing it on our journey into Dunbar. Thanks, Jason, and
thank you.
Thanks, Barbara.